It's in the name of democracy that we bring to you the High Horsemen of the Apocalypse.
Is that recording? We've been recording.
Yeah.
Okay, alright. So what were we going to talk about?
There's so many things, and the problem with it is that it's like a vast kind of network of ideas.
Yeah.
Right, and the ideas all kind of depend on each other. The sort of episode one that I've been thinking about for a while has been this one called The Gospel According to Jordan Peterson.
Right.
And this was like, an alternate title was like, it had something to do with like good news and bad news. Like Jordan Peterson, the good news and the bad news. Right? And this is like, so I think the good news of Jordan Peterson is like, you know what gospel means? It's in Greek, it means good news.
Okay.
Right? And so like the gospel in Christian terms was like, hey, this dude, Jesus Christ, he beat death.
Okay.
It's good news, everyone.
Okay.
You know that terrible inevitability that claims us all?
Yeah.
This one dude beat it, and he knows how, and so the good news is all you have to do is follow him, and then you can also beat death. That's what the gospel meant. And so there's like the gospel of Jordan Peterson.
Right.
Was like, hey, there's this thing that's the authoritarian left, and you don't have to be a slave to it. That's part of the good news. Is right, like you don't, even though it claims moral authority on an absolute level. It's like you must feel this way, and you must see things in this way, and if you don't see things in this way, you're a terrible person, and you should be loathed and shunned, and you'll be damned in addition to that. Yeah. Damned on earth, damned in eternity. You know? Right. And so the gospel, like the good news of Jordan Peterson is like, hey, actually that's not true.
That's not true. Yeah. I like how death and the authoritarian left, they both like pretty much claim everyone, you know? Like no one is immune to being attacked by the mob or being worm food.
That's true. The worm is the master of the emperor of all diet. I think that's how Hamlet put it. Your worm is your only emperor of diet. We fatten all to fatten ourselves, and fatten ourselves to fatten worms. Anyway, yes, death and the authoritarian left are like they're both have this all-encompassing claim, and that's how. I think that's an accurate analogy. Yeah. And Jordan Peterson said, well, no, you don't. You actually, their claim is not accurate. And you don't have to bow down to that. And that's the good news. Yeah. The bad news is that life is suffering. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
One phone down.
One phone down. Yeah.
The bad news is that life is suffering, and this is why, in fact, like the promise of the authoritarian left is if you give in to our value structure, if you accept it, right, then you get to have your suffering eased. That's the promise, because all you have to do is be like, well, actually, I'm a woman. Yeah. And you can do that, and then suddenly you become like, wow, you're a valued person. Yeah. Or you're a valued member of this society, and your individuality is really important to us. Right. And we actually want to bend over backwards to make your individuality feel welcome here, as long as you're insane and as long as you're completely dysfunctional. Yeah. And so that's the promise of it, and how those two things go together. The sense of like, yes, there is this moral injustice in the world, and if we all come together, we can stop it. Right. And as a bonus, this movement will completely indulge you, so long as you serve it. And the counter Jordan Peterson argument is like, well, you don't have to do that, but now you become responsible for your own suffering.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's the bad news.
Yes.
The bad news is that suffering isn't avoidable.
Yeah.
And the only way you can honestly deal with it without becoming a prey to some mass movement, because the mass movements appeal to so many people because they solve their suffering for them.
Right.
They offer the promise of your suffering can be eased if you just join us. And so, but if you don't join them, then you become responsible for yourself, and the only way to really to transform the suffering in your own life is through acts of personal responsibility. And that's the bad news.
Right.
And that's where it gets to okay, that's why the dude was a psychologist, right? And that was his sort of professional practice for decades, was helping individual people to build up structures of meaning in their own lives by their own actions.
Right.
Because generally, and this gets to Socrates as well, because from Socrates' perspective, the state of the soul, right, that's attached to its own to its own passions, is like a person chained to a wall, who's in love with their own chain.
Yes.
Right. And so it becomes a matter of asserting little bits of control and will in your life in order to build up that muscle, and that's the only muscle that will help you face the suffering of your life. And otherwise, you just become subject to the mass movements or your own depression.
Right. Are the how do I want to say this? The people that subscribe to the authoritarian left, right? Is their claim at all valid? Should straight white males, sacrifice themselves and be crucified by the multiple oppressed groups, and allow all these other people to, have sort of purpose in life? Because it would give all the groups purpose. It would give the oppressor groups purpose if they were to then be the fall guy, right? And then stand and take everyone's suffering, and then the oppressed groups, all they have to do is then just hate the oppressor.
Yeah, well, it seems to hold out the promise of a grand narrative that would provide meaning to a huge number of people.
Right.
Right? And the problem with it is that grand narrative creates disastrous situations. Like that, the Cultural Revolution in China, and you have this sort of, the Marxist it's a dystopian solution.
Clearly.
Right? And so I think from the perspective of the dystopian nature of actually buying into that grand narrative, I don't think they have a point in that sense. I think when you look at it from the perspective of, okay, are the hierarchies that exist in life and privilege certain people and at the expense of other people, those things are also real.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think the sense that there is a problem, that the world is unjust as a historical creation, I think that sense has validity. It's just what to do about it that's the issue.
Yeah.
And and I think it's hard to, and it tends to break down. Like it tends to break down like that the people who accept the hierarchy as it is tend to just think, oh, it's all good, and they don't want to know anything about the bad part of it.
Right.
Right. And that's where they also have to not think about conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
You know, it's like Ben Shapiro, like, he can't think about 9/11 because it would totally fuck up his worldview. Right?
How so?
If there were a power structure that were able to carry out a false flag on this level, kill thousands of people, start all these wars, and profit all off of it, that would fuck up the idea that we have basically a slightly imperfect meritocracy where things are working out for the best of everyone. You know, it's not perfect, but it's pretty damn good.
Yeah.
It would fuck it up and be like, actually, at the top there are these there are these people who are actually engineering events on a mass and horrific scale. That would blow up his idea.
Yeah. And then are there any grand narratives that would not be like, you know, dystopian or dystopian-esque?
Could be.
Because the sort of military-industrial complex provides a bunch of
grand narratives.
Where you need to avenge your fallen, you know, American.
Yep.
Or you need to go and stop these brutal regimes and.
Yeah, we were liberating women in Afghanistan, for example, or whatever. Yeah, that's true, and this is a deep question that was really confronted by like the Western world in like the 20th century. This is what postmodernism came out of, that question, in a sense.
Yeah. That
like, well, are there any, like, are all grand narratives ultimately dystopian?
Right.
And I don't know, but I think it seems pretty clear that they certainly tend in that direction. That grand narratives tend to be dystopian when masses of people buy into them.
Yeah. But then, in other words, it wouldn't be a grand narrative anymore.
Well,
so it defeats the purpose.
Yeah. Well, you have like grand narratives, like the, like, you know, there's this rebel Jewish sect.
No.
I forget what they're called. And Natari. They have some name. They're in Brooklyn. Okay, they're Hasidic Jews, and they're ultra Orthodox Jews, and they're against the state of Israel.
Okay.
And the reason they're against the state of Israel is because it wasn't created by God. Because Israel should only come into existence once the Messiah has arrived, and since the Messiah hasn't arrived, that Israel is a creation of force and not of God, and so that it's an imitation basically of. So they have this grand narrative, but their grand narrative is they're not in power, so they're like this marginalized group, right? And so it's like their grand narrative is kept from becoming dystopian by looking at the grand narrative that exists as dystopian.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like they're it's like the grand narrative becomes dystopian when everyone buys into it.
Right.
Very deep. It's a very deep problem.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, like revolution would be like the only sort of grand narrative that isn't dystopian, because, I mean, overthrow, like some sort of like dictator, right? Ultimately, like that's like a positive thing, and it can lead to, like freedom and democracy for a country of people. And it's also like not the end. Like all the other grand narratives that we have discussed so far, they're all like sort of like end game.
Like apocalyptic.
They're not like apocalyptic, but they're all like meant to like go on forever. The military-industrial complex, the crucifixion of straight white men.
The crucifixion is meant to go on forever.
Well,
I think from their perspective, it's not meant to go on forever. They're just going to fix history, and then we can start again.
But when would that ever start?
It doesn't. That's why it's dystopian, because it doesn't work.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's not meant to go on forever. It's just meant to we're going to reset things.
It looks like it would go on forever though, because the authoritarian left would have to continue to call out anyone that thinks differently,
Yes. Well, this is the thing. This came up in communism when at the beginning of the Soviet Union. Right. So Marx had this idea of capitalism turning into communism. Eventually, capitalism would lead to socialism because of the intrinsic flaws in capitalism. Mm-hmm. Because people just recognize we just need to reorganize this. Didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And so Lenin basically said, look, it's an infantile fantasy to imagine that that's going to work like that. What we need to do is create a dictatorship of the proletariat, and then we will reprogram human beings. We will stamp out the capitalist impulse in individual, down to the level of the individual, and then we can have communism. Once we've rewritten human nature, then we can have communism. And I think that's the idea that the authoritarian left is like, look, once we decolonize everyone's minds, once we deprogram you from patriarchy, once we've done it all, then we can have just the utopian society.
But then you're like automatically like becoming what you sought to destroy, because you're like, one, if like racism is something that you need to like erase from human history, well, you're using it to target white people, like you're automatically like failing, because you're putting people in oppressor groups just based on race, even though there's different white ethnicities, like Irish people never had fucking slaves.
That's true. That's true. You are doing that, and there's two ways that's usually dealt with psychologically. One is just to live in denial. That's what's happening. Because
there's no such thing as reverse racism.
Right. Because there's no such thing as it. And the other is to accept that that's what's happening, but it's just a temporary corrective. Right. And it's just like Lenin saying, we're just creating this dictatorship for now. We're just going to create the most oppressive dictatorship in human history for now. It's just so we can reprogram everyone.
That's funny. It's funny because like on Twitter I see a lot of for lack of a better word, I'm just gonna call them fucking morons, because they're always tweeting about how the late stages of capitalism are so unfair and horrendous. And it's like, well, have you seen the beginning stages of communism? It's like I also think it's funny that when people on like the left on Twitter will say like, there's no such thing as reverse racism. And it's like, yeah, you're right, it's just called racism. You're right, it's just racism, everybody.
Yes, well, one of the sort of advantages of that way of thinking about it, that there's no such thing as reverse racism, is that it gets to accept the basic bigotry of human beings and just recontextualize it. And so it's not really trying to say hey, look, don't be a bigot.
Yeah.
Because that's too hard. It's too hard to erase bigotry from people.
Yeah.
So it just gives them a justified form of bigotry,
Mm-hmm.
which is both one of its like perks as a system.
Yeah.
And something that really blows about it, you know, it's like it's something that's really offensive about the system, and that's also why it works so well.
Right.
You know, because it's like it's like with comedy,
Mm-hmm.
right? At a certain point, I realized that comedy was often dependent on cruelty to
Yeah.
someone,
Uh-huh.
you know. And then once I started to realize that, it was hard to make those jokes
Yeah.
anymore, because I'm like, well, I don't want to just,
Well, I don't want to.
you know what I mean? It's like I don't want to sort of make that joke,
Yeah.
because it's like that joke is going to be at that person's expense, and
Yeah.
I could see that. But like, if you have a group of like people who you can whip,
Uh-huh.
then great. Then you can orient all your jokes toward those. Even if they're not even very good jokes, at least you can be cruel to someone.
Yeah.
And that form of like cruel humor at someone's expense
Uh-huh.
is like a least common denominator, lowest common denominator. You know.
That's why self-deprecating humor has always been my favorite, because then you sort of, you know, at least you're responsible for your own suffering with
Right.
self-deprecating humor.
Exactly. Yeah. It's yeah. I agree with
You
that.
have your permission, and
You have consent.
yeah, you have consent, and you know how far you want to take it.
Maybe you might have to have a talk with yourself later.
Sit down in
hurt
the
my
mirror.
feelings.
Yeah. Gonna look myself in the eye
Have
in
a
the
Gillette
mirror.
moment.
Gillette moment.